Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
We've made effectively a quantum leap in knowing why we are as we are, why we take the decisions as we do, and then the implications for policymakers. If we know all that, then why don't we use the things we know in order to get the outcomes that we desire?
I'm going to dig deep. I'm going to really talk about the philosophical underpinning of our current use of neuroscience. I've been involved in clinical neuroscience for some 30 to 35 years, and I've been enormously impressed of the advances that have taken place during this time in our understanding how the brain works. But we still understand only a little bit about how the brain works. And we understand some aspects of the neural underpinnings of normal function. The thing that's excited me about appropriate uses of neuroscience is that it's helped us to understand the effects of brain damage due to disease or injury and ways of preventing or reversing them or limiting their adverse effects. So, nothing wrong with neuroscience. The problem is with neuromania. How do people catch neuromania? Well, they catch it through an assumption, the assumption that human consciousness is identical with neural activity in the human brain. And you will have heard again and again, you are your brain. There are these two pillars of unwisdom, two aspects of what I've called biologism. Darwinitis is the belief that Darwinian explanations encompass not only the biological roots of this human organism that I am, but the cultural leaves of the human person. And there's a link between neuromania and Darwinitis. That's why you see so many references not only to neuroaesthetics or neuroethics or whatever, but evolutionary aesthetics and evolutionary ethics. The two are linked together. Because since the brain is an evolved organ, if you have a neural explanation of human consciousness, this would demand a Darwinian interpretation of our behavior, because our behavior would simply be a manifestation of this evolved organ called the brain. So the background problem is biologism, the belief that human beings are essentially biological organisms and they're best understood through the biological sciences. Okay, let me now focus on neuromania. What's the problem with neuromania? Well, first of all, there's a logical error. The idea that you are your brain, or that your consciousness and everything you are is neural activity, is based on a confusion between a necessary condition and a sufficient condition. Of course, neural activity is a necessary condition for every aspect of consciousness, from the slightest tingling of sensation to the most exquisitely constructed sense of self. But it's not a sufficient condition. And let me just remind people about the difference between a necessary and a sufficient condition. It's a necessary condition for me to be in London in order to be knocked down by a bus in London. But that is not, thank God, a sufficient condition. Otherwise, I wouldn't be giving this lecture. And in fact, people go further and say that neural activity is a sufficient condition of consciousness. They think perhaps it's the cause of consciousness. But the real neuromaniacs, who are in the majority, think that it is the very stuff of consciousness. And they arrive at that conclusion by confusing correlation with causation and correlation with identity. If, for example, I am looking at an object, there will be activity in my occipital cortex, my visual pathways. And they conclude from the fact that there's correlation between my looking and my experience of the object and activity in the occipital cortex. They conclude that the activity which correlates with the experience is identical with experience. But correlation is not causation. Correlation is not identity. But I want to look at the ways in which neuromania have entered our collective consciousness, and indeed it's been suggested that neuroscience might give us clues to rather higher level phenomena such as voting patterns, behaving correctly, falling in love, etc., etc. And there are methodological problems with a lot of the studies that have seemed to suggest this. The first is they grossly exaggerate the precision of observations. Although functional magnetic resonance imaging is a fantastic tool, and I, as a clinician, welcomed it with open arms as giving us some insight into what was going on in the brains of people with various conditions, it is still a very blunt instrument. You will hear that scientists have now cracked what love is, what wisdom is, what beauty is, how we have ethical sentiments, what aesthetic experiences are, why we make decisions in a shopping mall, and indeed all aspects of our social behavior. And just to give you some flavor of how weak the actual science behind this is, I want to talk about love. I want to talk about love, brackets romantic, which was the basis of a study by Andreas Bartels and Semir Zeki, a paper published 10 years ago, which caused quite a frisson in the press. How did they find the secret of love? Well, this is what they did, ladies and gentlemen. They placed the head of their subjects in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanning machine. They then asked these individuals to look at pictures of their beloved, people they were passionately in love with, and look at pictures of mere friends. And what they did then was subtract the brain activity that was associated with looking at mere friends from the brain activity of looking at people they were passionately in love with. And that was how they decided what passionately being in love consisted of. They repeated it many times on many subjects. And they came to this conclusion, which was that love romantic is due to activity in a highly restricted area of the brain, in the medial insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, and subcortically in the caudate nucleus, and thank heavens the putamen, and all bilaterally, thank God. So it was serious love. It wasn't just trivial. Or if you wanted in pictures, that was what love was. What was wrong with that experiment? Well, here's a primer on love for Martians and neuromaniacs. Anybody who's been in love, or read about it in a book, or even read about it in a crayoning book, will know that it's not like a stimulus, not like a response to a simple stimulus such as a picture. It's not even a single enduring state like being cold. It is a many splendid, and indeed many miseried thing. It includes things like not feeling in love at that moment, hunger for the beloved, simulated indifference to the beloved, delight over the beloved, wanting to be kind to that special other, wanting to impress him or her. It concludes lust, a bit biological that, but it includes awe, surprise, joy, guilt, anger, jealousy. It concludes imagining conversations with the beloved, imagining events together, speculating what the loved one is doing, feeling, and thinking. Not the kind of thing you might imagine would be tucked away in a small part of the intracranial darkness of an organ that is supposed to have evolved many hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of years ago. Love belongs to a self that relates to a community of minds, and it's not confined to the intracranial darkness into which scans can peer. I mean, if we have serious problems understanding the relationship between the brain and even basic perception, it's absurd to look to brain science to cast light on the upper stories of human consciousness. For example, devising social policy or understanding the nature of love and so on. And, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you, there are profound problems in understanding the relationship between basic perception and neural activity. When I look at a glass, light is interfered with by the glass, and that interfered with light enters my eyes, tickles up my occipital cortex, and sends signals down the visual pathways. Great. That's a straightforward causal chain that is understood clearly on the basis of physics. That's one-way arrow. But hang on a moment, what happens when we get here? That neural activity has then somehow to be about, or to refer to, or to reach towards what happened in the glass. It has to reconstruct the glass from all that interference with the light. And that is deeply mysterious. And that has nothing to do with the normal processes that occur in the physical world. The inward material causal chain, light from the glass ultimately into my occipital cortex or whatever, explains how the light gets into my brain, but not how this results in a gaze that looks out. And in fact, the mystery of intentionality, which is what I'm talking about, would be deepened if perception really were identical with neural activity. For then my perception of the glass would require the neural activity in my visual cortex to reach causally upstream to the events that caused this neural activity. And this is, of course, at odds with the materialist orthodoxy. Should that worry you? Yes, because the materialist orthodoxy is the orthodoxy that underpins Neuromania. And here I can quote basically the supreme professor, indeed vice-chancellor of Neuromania, Daniel Dennett. There is only one sort of stuff, he says, namely matter, okay? The physical stuff of physics, the physical stuff of physics. Chemistry and physiology as well. And the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. We can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. So that's their position. And you can see how that position actually undermines any attempt to explain something even as simple, or seemingly simple, as my perception of an object. So when we're talking about the brain, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about a piece of matter subject to the laws of physics. And nothing in physical science can explain why a physical object such as a brain should find, uncover, or create appearances so that this thing, which has no intrinsic appearance, appears to me. And one of the interesting things is most of the contents of consciousness consist of what we call secondary qualities, feelings of warmth, colour, and so on and so forth. That's the very stuff of consciousness. And even if we began with the notion that neural activity was identical with consciousness, we would have to concede that the brain transcends or gets outside of itself. If we really did think that consciousness was this activity in my occipital cortex, we'd have to acknowledge that this bit transcends itself and actually reaches out to that item that I'm aware of. And neuromania seems to succeed because it denies the distance between neural activity and experience. The truth is that neural activity is quite unlike experience. The neural activity in the visual pathways is unlike the appearance of the glass to me. And the least you might expect of something is that it should be like itself. So neural activity is not identical with experience and consciousness. And brain is particularly poor at generating persons. Of course, being a piece of matter, it's person-free. You can get the impression that it generates persons by personifying the brain. You can brainify the person by personifying the brain. So if you talk about the brain deciding and signaling and detecting, if you anthropomorphize the brain, then of course you'll get a bit of an anthropos out of the brain just by shoving it in. But that kind of linguistic legerdemain it requires very little intelligence to spot. I'm going to just very briefly talk about two aspects of personhood that are particularly resistant to a materialist and hence neural explanation of consciousness. Unity and multiplicity and temporal depth. As I'm standing here, I'm aware of the pressure on my feet, I'm aware of my hands moving, I'm aware of my voice droning on as you are aware of it, I'm aware of all of you in front of me, both as individuals and as part of an audience. I have this multiple awareness all in the conscious moment. It's all part of a unity. But all of those things I'm aware of separately. This is the normal feature of the conscious moment, of many separate things are part of a unity. And there is no model within any machine or within any neurophysiological explanation of how we can get this unity of the conscious moment while keeping things separate, how we can get merging without mushing. Let me talk about temporal depth. I'm aware of the past. I'm aware of the future. My present moment makes sense to me because of the future towards which I'm reaching and the past with which it's impregnated. The difference in the future and the past is now. There is no now in physics. That's why there's no longer or not yet in physics. There's no difference between anticipation and nostalgia, which is absolutely central to us. Neural activity cannot give us a grasp on the community of minds, which is where all psychosocial decisions, psychosocial phenomena have their natural habitat. Neural activity belongs to the solitary organism. Of course, it gives us access to the community of minds, but is not itself identical with the community of minds. And I want to make a final visit to intentionality because it's absolutely central. It tears the hitherto seamless fabric of a causally closed material world. But it is the seed out of which grows first-person being, which is unique to humans, we may want to discuss that, and freedom, and the community of minds. And all of these things lie beyond the reach of neuroscience. Neuroscience may indeed be forced to deny them. We live in a semiosphere, which is fashioned out of meanings, not mechanisms. We're not just in a biosphere. We live in a public domain that transcends the organism Homo sapiens, and in particular, his or her brain. All of this is based on intentionality. The human world that we live in, where we do make our political decisions, where we do behave badly or well, has been constructed over hundreds of thousands of years. And this is how far Darwinitis is out of date. But this is the reason why we won't find selves, society, and the human brain, the human world, by peering into the brain. And the quintessence of neuromania and its application to neuroaesthetics and neuropolitics and evolution economics and so on is the problem or the error of trying to find the community of minds forged from 1 trillion cognitive handshakes in bits of the standalone brain lighting up in the intracranial darkness. That's why we have this idea that love can be identified with bits of the brain lighting up. And I want to end with a metaphor. We know that an oak wood grows out of acorns. But it's no good trying to, as it were, listen to an acorn with a stethoscope and hope that you'll hear the whispering of the leaves, the wind passing through the woods. You won't find, listening to or looking into the isolated brain, the community of minds which directly or indirectly it has given rise to.
So I don't disagree that the mind is more than the brain. I don't disagree also that some neuroscience and even some other behavioral science is kind of reductive mumbo-jumbo. I think we disagree about how useful it is to think about human nature and behavior as you do, primarily as something which should be usefully looked at as emerging from conscious, explicit discourse and decision-making. Or should we think it's also useful to think about human nature and behavior as something which involves exploring how our consciousness and culture are shaped by and interact with the physiological, the instinctive, and the unconscious. There's a lot of Ray's book is about that which is explicit, that the difference about human beings is that we make things explicit, that we have meanings, and he wants to focus on those areas where we make meanings, but I also think we need to look at those places where we don't make meanings because they are physiological, instinctive, and or conscious. Now, my own view is, and this is a very crude example, that we can think about human beings and human nature as imagining us as an elephant being ridden through a jungle, in which the rider of the jungle is our conscious brain, the elephant is our instinctive, evolved animal self, and the jungle is the kind of social mores in which we live. And we should understand human behavior as evolving from the interaction of the rider, the elephant, and the jungle. I think Ray would argue, or certainly the emphasis of his book is, that we should focus almost exclusively on the rider or on those bits of the jungle which the rider or other riders have chosen to cultivate. And we should be much less interested. We're far too interested in what's going on in relation to the elephant. And I'll give 3 reasons why I don't really agree with that and why I think the elephant is very interesting. And we should think about the interaction between the rider, the elephant, and the jungle, and not just the rider and what the rider says and what the rider says to other people. This enthusiasm, this focus on human nature and human behavior, which Ray attributes to advances in neuroscience, well, that's true, but there's another really, really important moment which leads to a lot of this speculation and to books like The Social Animal, and that is behavioral economics. So that is the work of Kalman and Tversky, which showed that in contrast to what had been argued in neoclassical economics, it didn't look as though human beings were utility-maximizing, entirely rational beings working in a perfect marketplace. It seemed actually as though lots of our behaviors were inexplicable in terms of self-interest or perfect information in a perfect marketplace. And that behavioral economics was a response to the dominance of neoclassical economics and a model of Homo economicus. And so the first point I want to make is this. If you don't have an account of human nature, if you're not interested in thinking about how the rider, the elephant, and the jungle interact, then there will be some other account of human nature, which is the default option. Now, Keynes said, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slave of some defunct economist. Now, he's absolutely right about that. So if we don't think about human nature, then we'll have to rely upon the model developed by economists, the mythological notion of Homo economicus. And that's what Kalman and Tversky and the whole library of behavioral economics that's come after that has been about, actually exploring the idiosyncratic way in which we really make decisions, some of which is related to our evolutionary our origins, and some of which is related to the ways in which our brains work. Now, the political importance of this is that neoclassical account of how human beings tick, that ultra-rationalist account of how human beings tick, that what human beings choose tells us what it is that they want rather than anything else going on, is what led to deregulatory policies. You could argue it's what led to the credit crunch. It's what was exposed. And what was the phrase that people used after the credit crunch to kind of push back against this view of rational man, this dominant view of rational man? Well, it was Keynes's phrase, the phrase animal spirits. Now, Ray invites us in the book to reject entirely those people who suggest that we should understand, that it's useful to understand human behavior in terms of animal spirits. But Keynes himself argued that we couldn't understand epidemics in the marketplace except by understanding the importance of what he called animal spirits. Those things, those irrationalities, based in the ways our brains work, based in our instincts, based on our evolution, which do not lead us to behave rationally at times of economic boom and bust. The second is, I don't agree with Ray that being interested in neuroscience and being interested in other behavioral sciences is always reductive. I think it can be enriching. We had a speaker, Dr. Paul Howard-Jones, who's been looking at the effect of the internet on the brain. One one of the really interesting things he's found is this. The internet doesn't seem to affect the brain in any kind of predictable way, so he says not really any evidence at all. But games do. And part of the explanation does indeed lie in neuroscience, because it appears that one of the reasons that games work is because they intermittently reward us. And this has led Paul Howard Jones, to do experiments with children using games in a whole classroom as a learning tool. And these experiments are looking very fruitful. Now, what excites me about that work is that it suggests that if children enjoy learning and they're engaged in learning, that it actually helps them learn, rather than being sitting in rows and learning things they can't really relate to at all. I think this is a big breakthrough. I think if we do know that game playing, and of course it doesn't have to be shoot 'em up, there can be all sorts of much more sophisticated and interesting games that encourage empathy or whatever, really helps children learn, that can advance our understanding. And what a change that is to the kind of debate which Ray would prefer, which is the debate which has dogged us in education, which is the culture wars debate, where we have two fixed sides, educational progressives versus educational reactionaries, a debate that's been going round and round and round and round to the point of tedium, which leads Michael Gove to now be advocating that we return to the grammar schools of the 1970s. Now, if neuroscience and behavioural sciences enable us, provide us with little new bits of evidence and confirmation, which enable us to escape that terrible deadening culture war and instead innovate in classrooms, then I think it's a great thing. And I'm delighted that it's happening, and I'm even happy that fMRI scans are part of that debate. Finally, and to my closing point, one of the things that is distinctive about human beings, and Ray makes this point, I think it's absolutely right, is that we alone think about thinking. But I think if we are going to think about thinking, we should think about thinking in a way which doesn't privilege one particular type of thinking, conscious thinking, above other processes that are taking place in our brains. Our thinking about thinking should encompass an awareness of our instincts, our idiosyncrasies, those things which go on and drive our behaviour, which we are not aware of. And these can lead, Ray again in his book rejects any idea that any of this stuff has got any policy relevance. It can lead to genuine policy innovations. And so to close, the fact that we know that people are not very good at the long term, and there are certain weaknesses, cognitive frailties that we have in relation to numbers, leads, in my view, quite legitimately to a policy of pension opting in, because we say we want to opt into pension, to save pensions, but we don't. It's also legitimate to regulate financial products because we don't understand them and they can be designed in ways which appeal to us and get us to make unwise decisions. We can, in this world, use new strategies. There is a fantastic website called Stick in America, which people are using to change their habits because they understand our cognitive frailties. They understood that even though they say to themselves and they say to their friends every day, I'm going to be a better person, actually there are things about them and their brains which mean that they won't quite make it, so they need to slightly tilt the balance. And also, it's leading to all sorts of interesting things like the growth of mindfulness, which I think mindfulness and awareness of the value for well-being that comes from mindfulness is also, I think, a reflection of things that we've learned through understanding brains, understanding behaviour in different ways, and it's a major phenomenon and a jolly good thing too.
Effectively, you give no weight at all, in the end, to the unconscious. You just don't attach sufficient weight to it. You're not prepared to go there. For you, essentially, the rational mind and this slightly mystical phrase, the community of minds, is everything. How do you answer that?
Well, I think Matthew's misrepresented me, suggesting that I don't for a moment imagine that a lot of what we do is either automatic or unconscious. And Keynes famously said, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, all these things that he said. So I don't think we had to look to neuroscience to discover unconscious motivations, inattentions, automatisms, and so on. You just see that as a surface phenomenon. So we didn't require brain science to tell us. If we did require brain science, it's unlikely it's going to tell us more than we knew already from behavioral observations. What additional information does neuroscience give us, given that all of us accept that we behave irrationally?
I think one of the powers of this area of research at the moment, and one of the reasons we're seeing the emergence, you're very disparaging about the emergence of these new disciplines of neuro at the front of them. But I think that...
they're not genuine neuroscience disciplines, but neuroaesthetics and neurobolics and all that sort of stuff. Yes,
but I think at their best what these new disciplines show is that there's an interaction of observing a behaviour in the real world, possibly then seeking to observe that behaviour in laboratory situations, but then also understanding what it appears to be going on in the brain, and then I think and that's the example that I gave of Paul Howard Jones. He observes something, he then sees, well, is that credible in terms of what might be happening? Why would it be that games work? And then he can see, well, it might work because they release dopamine in a particular way, and we know from animal experiments, and you're very clear that you don't think we should be learning much from animals, that this kind of reward mechanism works. And that seems to come up with quite a rich hypothesis, which he's now testing. So what works is when you get the interaction of neuroscience and behavioural science, and also all sorts of other disciplines, and even including philosophy. And I think that's what advances our understanding. Now, I don't know why it is you want to reject neuroscience from being part of that multidisciplinary dialogue.
I have no problem if it tells us something new. But most of the time, you can cut out the middleman in these kinds of things. For example, the example you gave, he could simply observe the effects of the games. He doesn't have to do scanning, which actually is incredibly crude. A lot of people who haven't been involved in scanning have no idea how crude scannings are. I'm just thinking of an example that I think it was Matt Grist gave when he was talking about the work of that admirable person, Camilla Batmanghello, who has done some extraordinary work, many of you will be familiar with it, with children who've had appalling privation and have no trust in the world outside them and have huge behavioural problems. And she appears to have had good results. She now wants to pop these kids' heads into the washing machine and do fMRI scanning to find out if she really is making a difference. And that's almost like saying, well, it works in practice, but that's not good enough. Let's see if it works in theory. That's the kind of problem. It seems to me that there's a glamour of neuroscience.
Ray, this is exactly, you see, where we are. Because you know, the interesting thing is that your reliance upon this mystical community of many minds hasn't really got us very far in many cases. I mean, I gave the example of educational debate, which is the most depressing, predictable, go around the same merry-go-round of different positions. When, for example, we were able to see in monkeys the genuine observable impact upon their neurological makeup of deprivation, of maternal deprivation in childhood. This does, I mean, maybe you prefer people didn't need this scientific evidence, but this does seem to provide and has contributed to a recognition of the vital importance of early years in shaping children. Now, you may say, well, shouldn't we just have been able to see it? Well, maybe we should have just been able to see it, but we didn't.
But
and the very fact that all politicians of all stripes now recognise the importance of early years is not unrelated to the fact that we now have a scientific basis as well as a kind of as well as a sociological basis or a political basis or an ethical basis for arguing that deprivation in childhood leads to long-term damage.
What you said is historically untrue. Long before the Hollows did their studies on maternal deprivation in monkeys, John Bowlby had done his work on children adolescents who were delinquents, to use his phrase, in the 1940s, and it was early recognised that the failure to have proper attachments and bonding and so on would lead to huge behavioural problems later in life. He didn't have to look at monkeys, he just had to look at kids.
But my point is that our understanding of these things does not seem to have had the power that is gained when you add to that, it has to be additive, when you add to that the fact that there is something observable in the brain which seems to go alongside this other evidence. So, and go back to my example around pensions. However much we might have said, look, it's obvious that people have a problem with the long term, and it's obvious that there's a problem when people say they want to save for their pensions but they don't. People rejected any idea that the state might paternalistically intervene because the view would be, well, this is just moral weakness. You know, people want to save, but they don't. They're just morally weak. And that is the common sense view, a very powerful common sense view. Now, the fact that we've now moved to a policy of opting people in is a recognition of our cognitive frailties, and that partly has a scientific explanation.
But Matthew, I want to ask you a question here. Is that cognitive frailty a continuous thing, or is it a cultural phenomenon? In other words, would you expect exactly the same cognitive frailty in a 15th century Florentine? If not, then doesn't Ray's point hold, which is that it's not a community of minds, but what it is a kind of cultural construct that you're barely aware of, represents something akin to your unconscious, but nevertheless which is explicable, if you like, by the development of ideas, and also possibly explicable to the way we are as young animals and then growing up.
Yeah, look, I think ideas matter, but I think ideas matter at many levels. Self-help books which appeal to your conscious mind, appeal to your decision-making capacities, appeal to the rider, are utterly useless. They are, in fact, if there's any evidence at all, self-help books make you miserable and slightly worse as human beings. You know, they just make you dislike yourself and hate yourself for the fact that you can't get to step 3 of the 18-step plan. What is absolutely clear, however, is if you want to be a better person, there's a very simple strategy: choose better friends. If you surround yourself with better people, then you will become a better person, because that's how social networks work. It won't happen as a consequence of your decisions, it will happen as a consequence of those social norms affecting you. So yes, culture is incredibly important, but the way in which culture is important is not necessarily through this explicit relationship through conscious choice, it's also through the way in which automatic and instinctive processes work.
No, that's absolutely true, but you've taken culture at the level of the consciousness of the idea of it. Of course, most culture exists without people even aware that they are in a culture. They're not even aware. It is the things that you take absolutely as read, that you do not question, that have been around you from the various early...
But why is it,
anyway,
why is it we choose to copy others, though? And part of the reason we choose to copy others is because there are parts of our brains which are encourage us so to do. You know, that is part of what this process is. If we were not neurologically inclined to copy others, then it really presumably wouldn't matter what anybody else did. We would all be consciously making our choices all the time. We'd all be independent of each other, and who knows what would be the outcome of that.
Let's take the example of if you want to make yourself a better person. As with conscious self-exaltation and reading books on self-help may not work, and that is being demonstrated brilliantly by Alcoholics Anonymous. It's absolutely the first thing if you want to recover from alcoholism to say this is bigger than me. And that has got no neuroscience behind it, but Alcoholics Anonymous works because it's a recognition that it's no use. Self-exaltation won't work when you're dealing with something as profound as that. So these aren't new discoveries. And also, when you start talking about, say, reward chemicals, I mean, dopamine, it's got lots of jobs, dopamine, you know, and rewards are a variety of things. I mean, dopamine is responsible probably for schizophrenia. And so that's a busy job to keep dopamine busy, but it's also responsible for reward. But what do you mean by reward? There is a reward from having a hit of coke. There is a reward from a life well lived. So in other words, invoking these kind of neurological characters doesn't really help us to make those kinds of distinctions and decisions that are essential at the psychosocial level.
What comes first, the feeling or the dopamine? That's, I mean, essentially that's what you're talking about correlation and cause. Does the fact that you feel something or you're in a situation create the dopamine, or does the dopamine create the feeling?
I suspect it's a circular phenomenon, you know, and to some extent, you know, for example, under certain cultures, behaving in a certain way will be rewarding. In other ways, it will, you know, for example, being altruistic may be rewarding. In other cultures, it'll be seen as a sign of weakness. So you can see there's an interplay between the culture you're in and the feeling of reward, which may or may not be associated with particular dopaminergic pathways in the nervous system.
You see, Ray, what's the problem with that? So in other sciences, the way the science advances is that things are observed in nature, and then we come to understand why that might be happening on different levels of reality. It might be happening at an atomic level, or it might be happening at a chemical level, or whatever, and that confirms what we see. And then when we see something that doesn't confirm what we see, that's a question for science to resolve, and that's how science, to an extent, advances. Now, similarly, I think the fact that we can understand behaviour at a cultural level, but also at a kind of behavioural level, an evolutionary level, but we also might understand what's going on in the brain, can lead us to a better understanding. It can confirm certain hypotheses. It can lead to questioning of other hypotheses. Now, I completely agree with you that to suggest that you can rely on neuroscience entirely would be like suggesting that you can understand the world just by understanding the interaction of atoms.
And I realise that's not your point. I'm saying what new does it bring to the party? Take the issue of deferred...
Well, it might confirm some things and make them look like stronger arguments, and it might lead in other cases to say, well, this doesn't seem to be confirmed, and so let's look at this again. Maybe we need another explanation.
If neuroscience doesn't confirm it, but it's a blindingly obvious truth, then you may not wish, you know, it's something that's a phenomenon that is observed. I mean, take deferred gratification, which is what we've been talking about. I mean, there is the old story, there is a cultural determinant of deferred gratification. Middle-class people have deferred gratification, they save up, etc., and working class people, because for all sorts of reasons we could explore, may not go in for deferred gratification. Now, the neuromaniacs would say, let's look at deferred gratification by looking at brains. And what we see is a balance between the frontal lobe, which says, wait, judgment, and the amygdaloid body says, I want it now. And you look at the balance between the amygdaloid body and the frontal lobes. And, well, hang on a moment. Both middle-class people and traditionally working-class people have the same brains. What is different is the cultural expectation. So, in other words, the failure to show any difference in the brains, between the brains of people who do not have deferred gratification as a model, an ideal, and those who do, the failure to show it wouldn't say, oh, perhaps there isn't that difference. You know, I can think of no
But I
circumstance
think culture
where...
and brains you see, I think what happens is that culture and brains interact in the sense that a predisposition in a brain or a particular form of socialization leads to a subtle change in the brain, which then leads to processes of reinforcement. Now, so the famous example, as you know, when it comes to deferred gratification, is the Marshmallow Test, in which it is found that children's capacity to withstand the offer of a marshmallow at the age of 5 is a pretty good predictor of their life chances throughout life.
Yeah.
Now, that is, I think, because the interaction of certain mental faculties and the social mores that surround them would lead to small changes becoming much bigger changes throughout life, to the point at which it's quite difficult to change people's life course. Now, I think neuroscience can explain one aspect of that phenomenon, only one aspect, but it can explain one and confirm it and lead us to better understanding of the impact on early years.
And how would it explain it, and what better understanding would it give?
Well, it would explain it to the extent if we were able to observe that those parts of the brains which seem to do the job of delayed gratification are more developed in certain people than others, we might want to explore why that would happen. And we might say, well, it seems to happen through a kind of process of reinforcement that is taking place, and therefore we need to try to break that chain of reinforcement early.
At the moment, put it mildly, it is premature to say that the brain science will usefully feed into political science, into social policy, and it looks in general as if it's unlikely ever to do so. But I will be delighted if we ever have an instance of brain science really trumping normal behavioural sciences. I have no problem, by the way, Matthew, with behavioural sciences. You know, the sort of stuff that's been done
Although it's
traditionally.
interesting you don't talk about them at all in the book.
No, because
but that's a richer debate, it seems to me. And you know, those people who share your kind of skepticism about all this stuff, it's not just about the neuroscience. It is about this general attempt to say that human nature, our instincts, how we've evolved, who we are as a species, because of course you extend your attack to Darwin, or Darwinitis as you put it, not to Darwin, but to Darwinitis. I think it is part of the more general critique of that way of thinking. It is useful to understand human beings and even to think about policy through understanding our instinctive selves as well as our rational, conscious selves.